Well, good morning. It is Thursday, just after 10 a.m. here on June 18th, and I wanted to give you a quick update on some major changes to the PPP loan and forgiveness process. So, those of you that have been keeping score know that the Senate, the House, and now President Trump has signed into law the PPP Flexibility Act. Now, that brought with it some major changes that are really going to be beneficial to your church and then any small business owners in your church that may have also applied for a PPP loan. Now, I know many of you are coming to the end of your 8 weeks, and so there's some concern, about getting maximum forgiveness, and I've received a lot of calls and emails regarding should we do some prepayment? Should we, try to sneak a few extra expenses in there? Well, let's real quick go over some of the major changes that were implemented with the Flexibility Act. Talk about some of the safe harbors that were put in place, which are they're massive, right? I was really excited to see the safe harbors that were put in place, and then let's talk about some next steps. So a few of the major changes that were put in place with the Flexibility Act were, first and foremost, the covered period. When we talk about covered period, we're talking about the time frame that you have to spend the funds that you received. Now, initially, as we all know, that was an 8-week period, right? You get the money, the timer starts, you've got 8 weeks to spend those funds. 75% on payroll, 25% on non-payroll. The Flexibility Act changed both of those items. So it moved the goalpost on the covered period from 8 weeks to now 24 weeks, right? So it added 16 additional weeks. Now, it's not that you have more money to spend, but just the money you received, instead of having to feel like you're cramming all of those expenditures into 8 weeks, you now have 24 weeks. Why did the SBA do this, or why did lawmakers feel like it was necessary to extend that out? Well, a lot of folks, specifically in the food industry, even some of you have experienced this with closures in childcare facilities or K through 12 schools, right? Like, we received the money, but a large part of our organization was completely shut down. So what they did was they said, let's expand the covered period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. An additional additional adjustment was changing the percentages from 75-25 split to 60-40. So now, not only do you have more time, but you can spend a greater amount of those funds on non-payroll expenses like rent, utilities, and interest on your mortgage. So those are the two big changes. 8 weeks, now you have 24 weeks. Instead of 75-25, you have a 60-40 split on how you can spend those monies. Additionally, two safe harbors were put into place. One that was already in existence, that we knew of, that if you had a reduction in your full-time employees from February 15th to April 26th, there was a safe harbor there that gave you an exemption from some of those FTE requirements, but a massive one. And I'll have a link to the forgiveness application instructions where you can read some more of this for yourself. But I want to read directly from the language. A massive one that affects, I believe, is going to affect most churches and most small businesses, is this. It says the borrower did not reduce. So this is a safe harbor or an exemption from the FTE requirement, right? I had a reduction in my full-time employee equivalent because, this is a big deal, the borrower, excuse me, you apply or you qualify for the exemption if you meet these requirements. The borrower did not reduce annual salary or hourly wages of any employee by more than 25% during the covered period compared to the first 3 months of the year, January, February, and March. So if you're an employer and you didn't reduce the annual salary or the hourly wage amount of any of your employees during the covered period, right, your 8 weeks or your 24 weeks, compared to January, February, March of 2020. So if you did that, you didn't make any reductions in the amounts greater than 25%, and the borrower was unable to operate during the covered period at the same level of business activity as before February 15th due to compliance requirements issued by the CDC or state health organizations. So what that includes is social distancing, that includes your services being shut down. So if you can demonstrate that I didn't reduce anybody's salary numbers, now that doesn't mean that your FTE didn't drop, but if you can show I didn't reduce anyone's salary by more than 25%, I didn't reduce anyone's hourly wages, and I was unable to operate at the same level, which that's pretty much all churches. If you're able to show those two things from as I read this, we currently understand it, you enter into an FTE safe harbor. So if you had reductions, that is not going to count against you for forgiveness, which is massive, right? Because that's going to be most organizations will be able to say, yes, I absolutely, I had circumstances or there were requirements placed upon me, right? We weren't able to meet, and now that we can meet, we're capped at 25% of our capacity. Now, how you demonstrate this, how you substantiate this, the last page says you will be required to maintain but not submit to the SBA documentation supporting the certification that that your business or your church was impacted during the covered period because of social distancing guidelines, and the language they use here is documentation must include copies of the applicable requirements for each location and relevant financial records. So that's as specific as they got. We don't know what that means. If I were you, I mean, I would be looking and taking, making sure I'm archiving any documentation you receive specifically from your state's health organization, maybe something they've posted on their website that says you specifically as a church cannot meet during this period, or now that you can meet, you're limited to 25% capacity. The other thing I would be looking at is, because it said relevant financial records, so I would look and say, can I show and again, they haven't clarified this, but can I show a reduce in attendance? Yes. For before February 15th compared to the covered period? Absolutely. Can I show a reduction in giving? Well, certainly in physical tithes and offerings collected, you'd be able to show an overall reduction. So we don't know specifically what they're going to require, but that is a massive safe harbor that will allow many of you, right? If you have a child care center, if there's a daycare attached to your church, or a kindergarten or a Christian school, right? And you had to reduce your FTE, or there was a reduction in your FTE, that's a gigantic safe harbor that you'll be able to take advantage of. So covered periods, right? Change in percentages. We talked a little bit about safe harbors. A couple commonly asked questions that I've gotten so far after the application has come out is, if I choose the 24-week period, which there's still some ambiguity out there around whether banks will make you make you wait the 24 weeks, or if you'll be able to apply at 8 weeks. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the lender. So the best thing I can say right now is contact your lender and see if there's any specific guidance. Because if history repeats itself, which I'm sure it will, the SBA has released the applications. Now they've sent these applications out to some 6,000 lenders that produced PPP loans, and then it's up to the lender to say, here's how your borrowers will apply, whether that's a electronic process, whether that is a very paper-laden process. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the lender to determine that. So with that being said, there's a couple things that we don't know. So if you choose that 24-week period and you spend all your money in 16 weeks. Well, can you apply at the 16-week mark? We don't know. If you spend it at 18 weeks, if you spend all of your money and you can apply for forgiveness in 8 weeks, well, according to the SBA, the way that I read it, you can choose either the 8-week or the 24-week. Now, this is important. This is an important distinction. Just because the SBA and the language of the Flexibility Act allows for it does not mean that your lender will allow it. Many of you ran into this issue with housing allowance, right? The SBA came out and clearly said, yes, housing allowance is allowable, but I can't tell you how many banks looked me in the eye and said, no, you cannot include housing allowance. So we want to get as much information out there as possible, because some of you may need to actually educate your lender on the process, especially if they're a smaller bank. They don't have somebody that's dedicated full time to this. So can I choose the 24 and apply early? We're not sure. A lot of that's going to be up to the bank. How to apply? That's going to be up to the bank as well. Some are going to have a paper process. Some are building out online tools, most likely as we speak. Next steps: definitely reach out to your lender to see if there's any guidance that they will be able to supply in relation to some of those questions. What the application process is going to look like, what's allowable, what's not allowable. Make sure you're tracking and documenting, right? That's a bit of a big question. How do we substantiate this? Well, if you read through the loan forgiveness application checklist, I've been highlighting and marking it up. I would definitely recommend reading through it. It's 4 pages long. It's the instructions for the easy application, which I'll provide a link to. Really helpful information. There's still some gaps in there, but read through it. It'll provide you a list of the documentation, things like payroll records, tax returns, like your 941s. You're doing any state tax, state unemployment insurance, you'll need to include those. You'll also need to include, it looks like payroll registers. You must include payroll records that separately list each employee and show the amounts paid to those employees. So you're going to need good payroll records. You're going to need good records or receipts of each one of the qualifying non-payroll expenditures. So the way that I think about it is treat it like a credit card reconciliation form, like you're turning in an expense report. Like, hey, here's my expenses and here's my receipts. So whether that receipt is a payroll record or a payroll tax return, like a quarterly filing, or if I'm saying, hey, here's my qualifying retirement and health insurance expenses on the employer side, and here's my bills, right? Here's my mortgage statement, and here's how much interest I paid. Here's my my Kaiser bill or my health insurance bill, and here's how much the employer portion was. Anything that we're going to submit, just be prepared to have some backup substantiating documentation. So I hope that's helpful. I know that there are still some questions that are lingering, but I wanted to get this out and say, hey, there's a ton of good news. Everybody can take a breath. We've got time to spend that money, and not only do we have more time, we can spend more on rent and other obligations, as well as there's just this massive safe harbor that says, hey, if you were impacted, you're going to provide, there is relief provided from the FTE reduction. So if you're currently a client of ours, know that we'll help and walk through kind of all the different caveats and different applications of this. But I hope this was helpful. And we know that we are praying for you and your church. We're believing that God is up to something. We've already heard a lot of stories of how you and your ministries are releasing incredible generosity into your communities during really an unprecedented time in our nation's history. So we're praying for you. We love you. We believe in you. If we can support you and your church in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. God bless you. And if there's any other updates, we'll do our best to keep you apprised of those as they come up. Have a great weekend, and know that we're praying for you. Take care.